Why just a peek a second ago, clear blue skies, but now lightning struck your last resolve. It's not an accident that no one hears your cries as your life strength seems to dissolve. You'll never see it coming. You'll see that my mind is too fast for eyes. You're done in by the time it's hit you, your last surprise. I'm coming for you. My game's always so fast, so fine. You're spun in by the net you didn't catch it in time. Better think about your game. Are you sure your next move's the right one for you? Are you sure you won't get outmaneuvered again and again, my friend? You'll never see it coming. You'll see that mind is too fast for eyes. You're done in time it's hit you, your last surprise. I'm coming.
It was a mess, but Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. I'm sure a lot of you are still working out on what class that you're wanting to play for Classic, and of course, what race is always the next question. So I've been wanting to go over all 8 races in the game, their racials, and how they affect each class. Today, everything's pretty balanced, and it's more based on aesthetics and personal preference, but in Classic, the racials were much more impactful in general, I'd say, and they could have big implications for your gameplay in both PvP and PvE. At the end of the day, you should pick what you want. Some people like to go for looks or role-playing, and some people like to optimize things. This video is mainly for the latter. I think it'll still be useful to the more casual audience though, and shed some light on some of the more powerful combinations, especially if you missed vanilla and you're coming from the current crowd. So I'm not necessarily telling you what to pick. The main goal here is to arm you with the information for you to make that decision yourself. The way I'll split this up is class by class and give you my top picks for both PvE and PvP. Since I want to be pretty thorough here, I'll just do alliance for this video, and I'll save Horde for the next part. Each race does have specific starting stats, which do have a minor impact. Here's a table showing all of them, courtesy of the vanilla World of Warcraft wiki. I'll have a link to that in the description. In the grand scheme of things, these aren't as impactful as the racials in my opinion. Like trolls have a higher agility than undead, but is 4 points really worth not being able to negate fear effects like an Onyxia or Magmadar to have that DPS uptime? I'll take these stats into consideration still, they just aren't that important to me because I put a high value in utility. So first, let's just take a broad look at all of the racials one by one to get a better understanding. You're going to see humans at the top of a lot of these lists, simply because they have really good racials for pretty much every class. We have diplomacy, which is insanely good, especially for vanilla. 10% increased reputation gain. You want to be a scepter bearer? Go human. You want your eternal quintessence sooner? Go human. Classic World of Warcraft has a good amount of reputation grinds to do. The Argent Dawn, the Winter Saber Trainers, the PvP factions, although they're not out at release, and more. They're all very time consuming, and 10% can save you days and even weeks of farming. It makes this a very powerful racial, even through just raw numbers. Now, like I said, the PvP gear won't be out at launch, so this might vary depending on when you're watching this video, but these factions can give you some pretty good gear. And the faster you get it, the bigger impact it'll have on your damage, healing, or tanking. The only downside I can say really is that assuming that Classic never gets updated, it'll eventually be a dead racial once you're exalted with everything. We also have the Human Spirit, which is a 5% increase in spirit. Pretty self-explanatory here. It makes them regenerate health and mana more quickly, mainly useful for priests on the Alliance side though, not really for everyone else, as I'll explain in a bit. Gnomes are generally the better casters, if you like to optimize things. We also have Perception, which is increased stealth detection for 20 seconds. Obviously, a PvP-oriented ability here. Very useful across the board, but some classes get a little more benefit from it than others, as I'll explain later. And lastly, we have one of the best in the game for PvE, and that's their sword and mace specialization. Increased skill with swords and maces, both one-handed and two-handed, by 5. Vanilla World of Warcraft had something called weapon skill, and another stat called defense. There are also attacks called glancing blows, which are basically normal attacks that do less damage. The higher your weapon skill in comparison to a target's defense, the more damage you'll do through these glancing blows. That alone is a very noticeable difference, but it also affects your chance to hit and crit. A 0.04% increase in all of the stats per weapon skill above the defense skill of your target. There's a ton of math and equations that go behind it, and it's something that's become very confused and convoluted due to private servers calculating things incorrectly and sort of muddying the waters. To sum it up though, weapon skill is very important to have for any melee DPS class. Like I said, it can even change your best in slot list. There's a set of level 44 mail gloves that non-human Fury Warriors considered to be best in slot for quite a while due to the fact that they have increased weapon skill. That's how important it is. Anyways, next up we have Dwarf. First we have increased gun skill. Now, ranged weapon skill isn't as useful as melee weapon skill, simply due to the fact that there are glancing blows for ranged weapons. You'll still get the added benefit of a higher chance to hit, but it's not anything huge. Some would even say negligible, and I'll go into further detail with that when we get to the Hunter. We also have Stone Form, which makes you immune to bleed, poison, and disease effects for 8 seconds, also increasing your armor by 10%. This is great to have in both PvE and PvP. In PvP, it clears things such as the Rogue's Crippling Poison, Along Uticite, an Undead Priest's Devouring Plague is big, and in Classic, there were a bunch of really horrible diseases that lasted for a really long time. It was so bad that if I was on my Paladin in a major city back in the day, I'd get whispers all the time from diseased people asking me to cleanse them. So one of the best racials in my opinion. Note that there is a consumable in the game called the Jungle Remedy, which is sort of like a mini Stone Form. This cures just diseases and poisons, and it doesn't make you immune. Some people consider this as a half replacement to the racial, so you can sometimes sort of have the best of both worlds. For this video, I don't count consumables because really, there are a ton of other ones. Do invisibility potions count as a replacement to Shadow Meld? What about free action potions versus Escape Artist? It's too variable to consider all of this, so I think the best way to do it is to just assume it's an even playing field of just racials versus racials. If you want to consider consumables like this, I'll leave that up to you. Anyways, back on subject here. They also have plus 10 frost resistance, which is useful more for the final raid of vanilla, which is of course Naxxramas, and also find treasure, which marks chests on your minimap. Kind of handy for gold making, but one thing that sucked about it is that you could only track one resource at a time, meaning that you'd have to choose between this or find herbs or mineral veins if you had herbalism or mining. And next up, we have the Gnome. First we have Escape Artist, which is escape the effects of any immobilization or movement speed reduction effect. A 0.5 second cast, and a 1 minute cooldown. This is pretty useful. I never really cared for the cast time. You can't use it on the move, and you're almost stunning yourself for half a second to clear a route or a slow. And PvP-wise, a lot of the slows that you'll be worried about will be things like Crippling Poison or Frostbolt, and that's stuff that's applied over and over anyways. It doesn't have the benefit of Stoneform, where it not only clears it, but it also makes you immune for a short period. A good trade-off, though, is the much shorter cooldown, so it's still pretty powerful. Next, we have Expansive Mind, which is a 5% intelligence increase. Intellect increases your mana and also your chance to crit, so this makes gnomes an appealing choice for casters in particular. They also gain more points in engineering, which is definitely handy considering it's probably the most expensive profession to level in vanilla. And lastly, they get arcane resistance, which is useful. For Classic, you really wanted either Fire, Nature, or Frost, since those are the most common spells in raiding, and Shadow for PvP. And this is kind of funny, but back in the day, when you hit water that was deep enough to swim in, it would knock you off your mount. Since gnomes are the shortest race, they have trouble with this. There are rivers or spots that you can jump across no problem and stay on your mount with every other race, whereas the poor gnomes can struggle to keep up. Kind of silly, but I thought I'd mention it in case it mattered to some of you out there. And lastly for the Alliance, we have the Night Elves. Shadow Meld is a stationary stealth. It works just like the Druid or Rogue stealth, except it's a bit weaker with the fact that it fades when you move, and people can also see you from further away compared to normal stealth. Also note that you can't use it in combat, unlike how it is now, but on the flip side, it only has a 10-second cooldown. More useful in PvP, as you'd imagine, getting the drop on people. PvP in vanilla isn't like today. Fights ended in a flash, so surprising and getting the opener on someone is hugely advantageous. It ensures you charge off as a warrior, or maybe you're a hunter defending the flag room. You can also eat and drink while it's active, which is also very useful. We also have Quickness, which is 1% dodge. Pretty handy for tanks in particular, which puts them at or near the top for protection warriors for a lot of people, although I think humans are generally picked due to that weapon skill. You also have the Wisp form when dead, which increases your movement speed by 50%, arguably more useful in vanilla since you'll be dying more often, especially for that death run to Ironforge if you plan on doing that. And lastly, they get 10 nature resistance, mainly handy for AQ40 here, for Huhuran, and a couple of other fights. So those are all of the racials. By now, you might have a basic idea of where these really shine for what classes, but let's go over them one by one, starting with the Rogue. Talking swords here, humans obviously for that weapon skill, but honestly, it's not as powerful as it could be for the Rogue. And that's because of their weapon expertise talent, which increases your skill with swords, fists, and daggers by 5 with 2 points. You do still get benefit, but there are some diminishing returns at higher weapon skill levels. I think it's somewhere around a 2% DPS change, partly due to the fact that your best offhand changes from the Hunger and Cold or Maladath, which increases your sword skill, to something like Iblis, which turns out better for humans due to the stats, versus that diminished benefit from weapon skill. For me, I still keep them on top because it is still an increase, and that reputation bonus is still big. And I know I mentioned it, but don't get too caught up in vested slot lists, because remember, we're getting progressive raids. So I talked about the Blackened Glare and Extremis, but it will be a while before they're even available, so try not to worry about that stuff too much. Wards take second, mainly because of how the Stoneform can play. Being able to clear some of those AQ40 poisons or a bleed for a clean vanish is pretty handy. Night Elves do take third for me. As a rogue or a druid, you do get a stealth boost from Shadow Meld, and it's pretty major. It makes pickpocketing or just stealthing through dungeons much easier, plus the dodge is always a nice bonus for solo play. And gnomes come in fourth for me. Talking escape artist here, with proper talents, you can already clear routes and snares with sprint and vanish anyways. I'm of the opinion of making your weak points stronger not buffing yourself in areas that you already excel in. For PvP, I like Dwarf first because of their stone form pretty much. Like I mentioned, you can use this to get a clean vanish off, which is really useful against rogue vs rogue, or any class with poisons or bleeds for that matter. It even clears blind, since that's a poison as well, which is another huge advantage. Like I said, stone form is an amazing racial in Classic. He was only nerfed years later in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion because Death Knights were complaining that they couldn't kill dwarves. All their damage was dependent on having diseases on their target, so that's when they finally saw the nerf bat. But it's back to its overpowered self in Classic, which is a good thing for Alliance players. Humans are also nice because Perception as a rogue has a higher value for me. You know the old saying in vanilla, what classes can beat a rogue? Well, a better rogue of course, and anyone who's played one will know that rogue vs rogue is all about who gets the opener. For players of equal skill and gear, the opener always wins if you play things right, so Perception, which is usable in stealth, is hard for me to beat in PvP. Also of course handy for druids trying to sneak a flag pickup in the Warsong Gulch. Plus, when those PvP factions come out, the faster you get that gear the better, so I do also consider diplomacy here. Gnomes do take third for me. Like I mentioned, I don't like Escape Artist for Rogue because we already have great mobility, but in the PvP scene, you gotta bump it up a bit. As strong as rogues are, they're really cooldown dependent, so if this can save you from burning a Vanish or a Sprint, that's still really handy. And Night Elves are trailing behind here at number 4 for me. Shadowmeld, as I recall, is about equal in power to Perception. I personally like Perception for Rogue vs Rogue since it increases your detection rather than increasing your stealth, so you're not just wandering around mashing cheap shot as much. But on the flip side, Shadowmeld does have the advantage of being useful against everything else, such as Warlocks and their invisibility detection. They're good, I just like the other racials more for PvP. And as for daggers, humans do get bumped down a bit since they no longer get that benefit from weapon skill. I imagine if you want to optimize things PvE wise, you're gonna be combat swords, but I just thought I'd mention it to be thorough. Next up, we have the warrior. Here are my lists, whether you're two-handed or dual-wielding. Like I said, you'll see human at the number 1 spot for a lot of classes since that weapon skill is so good. Even more so for warriors since they don't have any talents that increase it. And the rest is basically the same reasons for rogue and PvE. I have dwarves at number 2 because stone form is so good, and I do have gnomes above night elves because I think Escape Artist is a little more valuable as a warrior since they don't have as many mobility tools as a rogue. It could help for some fights. And on the PvP side of things, once again, I like dwarves the most for that stone form so you can kite rogues and get a free intercept basically since you can go immune to crippling poison. Keep devouring plague off you since shadow priests are probably one of the best 1 vs 1 classes in the entire game, and so on. Gnomes take second for me. Being able to clear a Frost Nova or a Wind Clip root is nice as a warrior, so really, either of those are great choices I think. Third place is a tough choice for me, but I go with human personally. I like popping rogues out of stealth I guess, so I like Perception over Shadowmeld here. But I think what puts it over the edge for me is that reputation bonus. There's some good played from both the Arathi Basin and the Warsong Gulch reputations, which is sort of an indirect buff since you'll get it sooner as a human. For tanking, you have a few choices here. I think human is sort of agreed to be number 1 due to that increased weapon skill for more rage and threat generation, and considering that Thunder Fury is like the holy grail of tanking weapons, it lines up perfectly. I didn't tank back in the day, but I think warriors started to have rage generation problems as they got geared up since they weren't taking as much damage. So because of this and their other bonuses, I have them as number 1 for the Alliance. Night Elves take second place for me due to their 1% dodge, and also nature resistance, which is notable for AQ40. Dwarf is third for me. You do get 10% armor from stone form, plus the debuff clears and some frost resistance. It's more situational though, whereas humans and night elves get their bonuses in pretty much every situation. And gnomes come in last. The only positive thing you can say really is Escape Artist, but I mean if you're tanking, you're probably going to have a paladin in your raid, so any movement speed or root is a non-issue anyway since they have Blessing of Freedom, or just dispels in general. And the last thing you want to do while tanking is to cast something, which makes you unable to dodge or parry. So they take a distant fourth for me. Next, we have the Paladin, usually relegated to healing in the PvE scene, but I thought I'd cover DPS as well because why not? Human is a clear winner here for that weapon skill, especially for Retribution Paladins since they're so dependent on auto attacks anyways. You really can't beat that in my opinion. I say the same thing for PvP as well, and that's because the Dwarf Stone form isn't as vital as a Paladin, I think. You can already cleanse poisons and diseases, and you have Blessing of Freedom for any movement and parrying abilities. Again, I like covering weak points instead of adding to strengths, so having that perception against rogues and druids and night elves and duels is a nice bonus. For healing, your first thought is probably human for that bonus spirit, but it's not as big of a bonus as you'd think, since I think paladins got most of their mana from crits via talents. The reason why I said this is more catered to priests earlier is because not counting mana per 5, you're locked out of regenerating mana as a caster unless you don't cast something for 5 seconds. It's called the 5-second rule, and priests get around this via the meditation talent, and they also have another one that gives them some spell damage and healing through spirit. So because of this, spirit in general is much more valuable to them. Paladins, on the other hand, don't really have any bonuses like that. The weapon skill as Holy is also pretty limited if you're going to be healing, so either human or dwarf I say, they're pretty even. Really, for healing, you should just go for the utility ratios rather than the numbers. If you want more reputation and perception, go human, and if you want stone form, go dwarf. You can also tank as a paladin, depending on your standard for the word. Like I said, warriors were the tanks in vanilla. I think the most the paladins tanked really were 5-mans, and maybe a few odd fights here and there. Like maybe the Twin Emperors due to their spell effects. Don't quote me on that one though. I'd say human once again for the weapon skill, but I'm afraid I'm not much help here. Sorry. Anyways, next up we have the mage. 2 choices here, gnome or human. The impactful ratios for the gnome are 5% intellect, which boosts your mana and crit, and also escape artist, which is just an added bonus. Whereas humans, we have spirit, which is pretty negligible for caster DPS in comparison to that bonus intellect. For PvP, I think it's another one you can go either way with without too much regret. It's basically perception versus escape artist and some intellect. It really depends on how much you fear rogues, I guess. If you want a more all-around useful racial, escape artist is the way to go. Personally, I prefer perception over escape artist in this case. But then again, you also have that bonus intellect. Like I said, for PvP, it's a tough choice. I guess I'd pick gnome if you forced me to choose though. Next, we have the hunter. For both PvE and PvP, my choice is dwarf, again for that stone form. Having that gives you an ace up your sleeve against rogues, which is doubly important for hunters because remember, they have that dead zone. If something gets too close to you, you can't shoot it. So anything to keep people at range is extremely valuable for PvP. Plus, as a hunter, one of your jobs will be to take down shadow priests with your mana drain, so having stone form against undead with their devouring plague will work wonders for you, and it's still useful in PvE as I discussed. Night elves can do some pretty nifty things in PvP with Feign Death and Shadow Meld, and if you get a stealth pet, you can really catch people off guard if you're guarding a flag in the Arathi Basin or Warsong Gulch. To me though, I just think that stone form is too strong to pass up if you want to optimize things. As for the dwarves plus gun skill, like I mentioned earlier, ranged attacks don't glance, so they don't get as huge of a benefit as compared to melee weapon skill. They still get added bonus from the increased chance to hit and whatnot, but it's not really a huge deal. Plus, add to the fact that a majority of the hunter's best weapons are bows and crossbows anyways, just takes away from it even more. Most of you will be using Rockdalar for a while, since the quest starter is a 50-50 chance from the Major Domo fight. That's pretty easy to get. And after that, the main upgrades are crossbows or other bows, as far as I recall. And you wouldn't really think it, but even the sound of guns is a big turnoff for a lot of people. It's not like today, where it sounds like a stapler. It's a musket, and it can wear on some people, especially if you're raiding for a few hours. It doesn't really bug me. I'll just throw it out there for you. Night Elves do have their pluses as well. Like you saw on that table, they have a high base agility, which is of course the main stat for hunters. And like I said, Shadow Meld is great for PvP and getting the drop on people. Really, I think this is another one that you could go either way with without too much regret. I just like dwarves because I like Stoneform so much. Plus, they can bench more. Winding down here though, just a few more to go. Next up, we have the Warlock. Choices are Gnome and Human, just like the Mage, and it's a lot of the same reasoning. Gnome is the go-to for PvE for that 5% intellect. It dwarves that spirit in comparison, especially considering that Warlocks generate mana through life tapping anyways, which, if you have more mana, you'll even save some global cooldowns. And on the PvP side of things, you can already detect stealth as a Warlock, which lessens the value of perception in my opinion. As for Escape Artist, this gets a little more value compared to my logic with mages. Getting a fear off and clearing any hindering effects will definitely be handy. And lastly, we have the Priest. I saved this one for last because it's a bit of a special case. One of the cool RPG elements back in the day was that priests got special abilities that depended on their race, and in general, these eclipsed the normal ratios for Alliance in my opinion. We have three choices here: Human, Dwarf, and Night Elf. Let's just go over the special abilities first. Humans get Desperate Prayer, which is an instant self-heal at a 10-minute cooldown, and with no mana cost. You also get Feedback, which is a defensive mana drain with some damage. Lasts for 15 seconds at a 3-minute cooldown. Dwarves have the same Desperate Prayer and also Fear Ward, which makes your target immune to the next fear, with a 30-second cooldown and 10-minute duration. And Night Elves get Elune's Grace, which reduces your range to damage taken, and gives you 10% dodge for 15 seconds with a 5-minute cooldown. And Star Shards, which is a channeled arcane damage spell. The highlight out of all of these is this spell right here. You may have even heard of how good this was, even if you never played Classic. It was so good, in fact, that in patch 2.3, Blizzard made it available to all races. It was way too imbalanced. Fear Ward by far is the best priest racial for the Alliance, so much so that it even used to guarantee you raid spots. It didn't matter how poorly geared or unskilled you were. If you were capable of pressing this button, come on in. This was so useful to have for both PvE and PvP. The Onyxia Fear becomes a non-issue for your tank, the Magmadar Fear, and plenty of others I'm sure I'm not thinking of. And combining that with Stoneform just makes them way too powerful in my eyes. For those wanting the absolute best mana regeneration, Human is a good choice for that 5% spirit. I talked about this during the Paladin section, but I'll say it again just in case you've been skipping through the video. Not counting mana per 5, you're locked out of regenerating mana as a caster, unless you don't cast something for 5 seconds. Priests have a talent called Meditation that gets around this, which allows for a little bit of mana regeneration even through casting, and another one that gives you spell damage and healing based on spirit. So with the 5% bonus, you do see some added benefit from Humans. Some people think that trumps Fear Ward, but personally, I'm Dwarf all the way. As for the other racials, the runner-up here is Desperate Prayer in terms of usefulness. No mana cost, which is notable, so just an all-around oh crap button to have, which is really handy. And the other ones are just little buffs that are pretty negligible in comparison. Star Shards isn't that useful because it's arcane damage. If you're a Shadow Priest, you want that shadow damage, obviously. And Feedback and Elune's Grace are just kind of little buffs to throw on. Too short of durations and too long of cooldowns to really be that useful in my opinion. PvP healing, I have the same idea here. Utility over everything, although do note that Fear Ward is a magic effect and it can be dispelled, so it's not all powerful. I also have the same with PvP DPS and PvE DPS. Guilds sometimes take one Shadow Priest for their Shadow Weaving debuff. I'm a believer that this time around things will be easier since these raids have been out for 14 years, and therefore guilds will be more lax and they'll take some of the lesser use specs more often. So with that and Fear Ward, you'll be quite the valuable member in a raid, even if you don't do the most damage. And lastly, we have the toughest choice, and that's the Druid. I know a lot of you struggle with this one, so here's my list for each category. I'll leave you to guess why I made these decisions. But anyways, that's about it for the Alliance. Again, at the end of the day, you should pick what you want. If you really like Arthas and you want to be just like him, make that human paladin. Or maybe you were like me and you thought that Dwarf Hunter in the cinematic was really cool, so you'll pick him. Just think carefully, because there aren't any race changes this time around. This will be the character you'll be spending 60 levels with. Again, this video isn't saying you must pick these races. The main goal was to shed some light on things that maybe you didn't know about. I know a lot of you are probably coming from the current game and you skipped Classic, so maybe you didn't know about stuff like weapon skill or the priest racials, so hopefully you gained some insight by watching this. Hopefully I hit all of the highlights. It has been over 11 years for me. If I have any questions, I'll have a pinned comment for you to check out. If you have any suggestions yourself, post them in the comments, and read through them as well, as I'm sure there'll be some helpful information in there.
I supply only the
I should be back
goods.
soon with the Horde video. I'll post it in the description whenever I get around to that if you favor that faction. I hope you found the video helpful, like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
You need something?
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.
If you were smart, would weave in a War Stomp for a guaranteed hit anyways, since you can't dodge while stunned, which was pretty effective in countering rogues. And just PvP in general is great. You just can't overstate the value of stuns, and the use for tanking is pretty obvious too, although not 100% ideal since it does have a cast time which makes you vulnerable for a brief moment, and is more useful for casual dungeons since raid bosses are of course immune to any crowd control. But speaking of tanking, we also have Endurance, which is increased total health by 5%. Note that, unlike the Orc racial Blood Fury, this is something that scales with your gear. The more stamina and health you have, the more you get from this 5%, so it's pretty useful, and it gets even better in time. We also have Cultivation, which is increased herbalism skill by 15. Not really too much to say about this. In vanilla, you used to actually be able to fail when picking up herbs or mining nodes, and the higher your skill level was in comparison to the required skill needed to grab the node, the higher success chance you had. So Taurens are the master flower pickers. With gear and enchants, you can get to level 325 as one. So it's really minor, but hey, there it is. And lastly, we have a plus 10 increase to nature resistance. Again, mainly useful for the AQ40 for a few fights in there. They also get a hidden racial though, and that's their increased melee range. Some people write this up to mythology and rumor, but there are PvP videos back then proving that they have a further reach than other races. The melee range for every other race in the game is 5 yards, but due to their size, Taurens get about a 2-yard increase, allowing them to reach players from further away. But what this also means is that players can reach you from further away as well, so it's not something that's 100% positive for them. In melee fights, it doesn't really give you an advantage, but against casters, for example, it does, since they don't care about meleeing people, of course. It came into use more in the Burning Crusade with pillar humping. Torn could actually reach through some pillars if a player was too close, and get a lucky mace stun off and catch them on occasion. It's just something to consider, advantageous in some ways and disadvantageous in others. I don't want to put too much emphasis on this yet, because I can see this as something that they mess up with the official classic, since they're using the modern engine. I still wanted to mention it though, so you're aware that it might be in. So if you're watching this video when it's released, just do a quick Google search or test it yourself to see if it made it in or not. And someone mentioned this in my last video. I thought it was a good point, so I'll bring it up too. Contrary to what the ladies tell me, size does matter. In PvP, there are people who click to target, so being a giant cow running around, you may find yourself being singled out more often than not. It's just human nature. If there's a big group battle coming up, people are going to default to the biggest target. So, whereas gnomes have an advantage for keeping a low profile, Torns have a disadvantage for being quite beefy. There are consumables and gadgets that decrease your size, but like I mentioned in the Alliance video, I don't consider any of that. If you start taking potions and whatnot into consideration, there are just way too many variables to consider this to be useful as a guide. So for this set of videos, it's just racials versus racials. Anyways, lastly we have the Troll. First up, we have Berserking, which increases your casting and attack speed by 10% to 30%, increasing the lower health you are, 10% at full health and 30% at critical. It lasts for 10 seconds and it has a 3-minute cooldown. So a nice attack speed boost here, and it actually puts them as a top race for tanking for a lot of people. Obviously, as a tank, you're going to be taking a lot of damage, so activating this for that 25% bonus really helps with your threat generation. Tanking in Classic was pretty tough because threat was much harder to manage. I think the skittish affix in Mythic Plus is form. Honestly, it's probably even worse than that. So, anything that helps out with threat is going to be highly valuable, and this racial is great for that, since as a tank, you'll be in those low health situations to get that bigger benefit. Even still though, the 10% is pretty good in general for anyone, PvE or PvP. Anything more than that though is pretty situational. In PvE, you obviously want to avoid damage, and you want to use it as much as possible. If you're waiting to use it until you take a lot of damage, it's kind of counterproductive. And in PvP, if you're saving it for that full boost, you're already dead anyways, since again, fights ended fast back then. Like I said though, it's still pretty good. We also have Beast Slaying, which is increased damage versus beasts by 5%. Just a nice raw damage boost here, mainly for leveling and grinding. There aren't a ton of beasts in raids. In fact, the only ones I can think of are Magmadar and the Core Hounds in the Molten Core, and a decent amount in Zul'Gurub, so don't put too much value into this if your end goal is raiding here. And we also have Throwing and Bow Specialization. Since I hyped up Orcs so much, you might think this is just as good, but ranged weapon skill isn't as useful as melee weapon skill, and that's because ranged attacks can't glance. You do still get some hit though, and the bow skill is more useful than the dwarf's gun skill that I talked about in the Alliance video, since bows in general are much more viable in raiding. Rockdalar being the one that most of you will have, since it's such a high drop rate. It's a nice bonus, just don't take it as high value as melee weapon skill. As for the throwing weapon skill, I'm not even going to dignify that with an explanation. And you know I had to save the best for the last, and that's regeneration. Health regeneration rate is increased by 10%, and 10% may continue during combat. This and that throwing weapon skill are the most infamous racials in Classic. They're so bad that they overshadow the entire race actually, which is a shame. Someone did the math, and assuming the max level and the best of the best gear with the most spirit, you'd be regenerating like 5 HP per second in combat. But hey, I heard if you chop off one of their extremities, it can grow back a little bigger, so they do have that going for them. So, those are all the racials. Next, let's go over each class and each role one by one, and I'll give you my top picks, starting with the Warrior. Just to throw this out there, these are all just my opinions and what my personal choices are. What I think is not fact, and I would just end the video right here, but I'm sharing my list anyways and my reasoning for them in hopes that it helps some insight for yourself. So feel free to yell at me or disagree or whatever. As long as it's constructive, I encourage it actually. I do have Orcs as number 1 here for DPS. The impactful racials are that Axe skill and also Blood Fury. As a DPS warrior, that Axe skill alone is hard to pass up, and adding in an attack power buff on top of that is a nice combo. The stun resist is alright. I don't remember too many stunning effects in the raiding scene on DPS back then though. Next up, I do have Trolls, and a lot of you might be asking what's wrong with me. Well, Trolls are the only other race that have an actual DPS buff for the Horde. At full health, that's still 10%, and attack speed is something that scales nicely with Warriors. Like I said earlier, I don't think you really want to hold on to this buff and wait to take damage, but there will be times where you get lucky and things line up nicely for you. Plus, as a warrior with Blood Rage, you can even cheat a little bit to get a little more out of it, so you have that extra synergy there. And while it is minor, the Beast Slaying can give you a bonus on a few fights. Like I said though, this video is filled with tough choices. For numbers 3 and 4, I have Undead and Tauren. For Undead, our impactful racial is pretty much just Will of the Forsaken. I would have them at number 2 if it wasn't for the fact that warriors already have an anti-fear effect. Berserker Rage gives you immunity for 10 seconds with a 30-second cooldown, which I think is enough for most fights and raids. Plus, with those Tremor Totems, as Horde, you already have tools against fears, charms, and sleeps. Like I said in the Alliance video, I like covering weak points, not buffing myself in areas that I already excel in, so I'd much rather have that 10 to 30% attack speed over another CC breaker in the PvE scene. As for Cannibalize, this isn't the most major ability, and you won't hear me bring it up a whole lot, but I feel like for Warrior, I have to emphasize it a bit more. Warriors by far were the hardest class to level back in the day, and you would spend a fortune on food. And even at the max level, just grinding mobs, you'd have to eat pretty much after every pull, so Cannibalize is such a handy ability to have if you're killing humanoid or undead enemies, and it'll save you quite a bit of money in the long run, so it's definitely worth considering here. And I do have Tauren at number 4 here. First up, we have Endurance, which is that 5% health, and that's nothing to sneeze at. Survivability is important because you do 0 DPS when you're dead. War Stomp is mainly a dungeon thing, nothing to really stun in raids, aside from the odd trash here and there. Nature Resistance is also one of the good ones, and it'll help you in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, and you'll possibly have that increased range, which can help for some fights. Honestly, I feel kind of bad at putting them at number 4 in fact. Like I said, it was hard to make this video since there are a lot of good choices. It really depends on your playstyle and how much you value survivability versus damage. Moving on to PvP here though, once again I have Orcs at number 1 here. Honestly, for the stun resistance, it really is such a good racial for PvP, and it'll give you a huge edge over rogues, paladins, or any class that relies on stuns. Warriors are tough, and ones that are hard to control are just ridiculous. And we also have Blood Fear, of course, which can be handy. The healing penalty is quite dangerous for PvP, so it's not as good as it could be, but it's there. Really, I like Orc mainly for that stun resist. This is just an added bonus for me. I do have Tauren next. The racials we care about are War Stomp, 5% health, and that increased range. All very nice for PvP. War Stomp is pretty self-explanatory. Stuns are great for PvP, and AoE stuns are even better, and 2 seconds is pretty long. The health is also nice to have, of course, and the range helps you close the gap on slippery hunters and casters. You just can't go wrong with either of these 2 races in the PvP scene in my eyes. I do have Undead at number 3 here. Impactful PvP racials are Will of the Forsaken for the most part, and to a lesser extent Cannibalize and Shadow Resistance. Same sort of reasoning as PvE DPS for me. We already have Berserker Rage, so that diminishes the value of Will of the Forsaken for me. You can't write it off completely though, because it's also for sleep and charm effects, which Berserker Rage does not protect against, and you also need to be in Berserker stance to use that, so Will of the Forsaken sort of gives you a protection blanket if you get caught in battle stance trying to get an overpower off, or in defensive stance trying to disarm or whatever. And lastly, we have Trolls at number 4. The only thing for PvP really is at Berserking, and it's what I said earlier, 10% is nice, but getting more than that in the PvP scene is tough because by the time you're at half or low health, it's pretty much over anyways. You can make an argument if you have a pocket healer and maybe you dip low for a second, then use it for that 25% boost, and then you get healed up to full and you go on a killing spree. That's deadly, but I mean, if you have a pocket healer, you're past the point of comparing racials in my opinion. It's my same logic with consumables. When you start bringing in things other than racials, there's no way to compare them. There are just way too many variables. So, in a pure racial versus racial viewpoint, they come in fourth for me. And lastly for Warrior, we have tanking, and as much as I just buried Trolls for PvP, they get their redemption here. As I mentioned, threat is a big concern for tanking in Classic. That's where the Berserking racial comes in. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're a tank, you're obviously going to be taking damage, so you'll oftentimes be in a nice position to get a bigger attack speed increase out of this, and the faster you attack, the more rage and threat you generate. So, because of this, I have them at number 1 if we're talking strictly tanking here. The next 3 are up for debate, I think. I do have Undead at number 2. Fear, Charm, and Sleep Breakers are especially important for tanks, and since you'll be in defensive stance, this removes Berserker stance from the equation, so I have to give it some added value here, even though it's the only racial that you really get benefit from as a tank. I would have them at number 1, but if you're a tank, chances are you're going to have a Shaman with a Tremor Totem in your group anyways. If you don't anticipate that happening, you might put them at number 1 instead. And next, I do have Tauren at number 3. The main thing in the raiding scene is their health boost. Like I said, it scales with gear, so it is a good bonus if your job is to take damage. I'd have them at number 1, but my mindset is if 5% health is the difference between life and death, you have a healer problem. I saw a good description of it online actually. Think of your health pool as a bucket of water which drains when you take damage, and it's the healer's job to fill it back up. The problem with this racial is that its bonus is at the bottom, and you only see benefit from it if you dip to extremely low health that would otherwise kill you if you weren't a Tauren. In every situation other than this, it's pretty much a dead racial. If things are going according to plan, you should never dip that low for this racial to be a lifesaver. As for War Stomp, this is also nice to have. Again, mainly useful for dungeons. Nothing to write home about in the raiding scene, but hey, it's there. If you only plan on doing dungeons endgame, you may want to give it more value. And lastly, for number 4, we have the Orc. Axe specialization and hardiness are the ones that we care about. You don't want Blood Fury, obviously, since it reduces healing by 50%. That's a good way to make your healers hate you. The axe specialization does have limited usefulness due to the fact that there really aren't any tanking axes. Most of the tanking weapons were swords, as far as I recall. I think there was maybe one from Nefarian that some people used, but like I said in the Alliance video, you're gonna eventually want Thunder Fury, and more realistically Kol Sirar or Maladath, so you'll be hard-pressed to justify switching to an inferior axe just to get benefit from this racial, especially when you have 3 other great races to choose from. Alright, like I said, this is quite the lengthy one. I got just about 20-ish more minutes of video to go through, and this is starting to drag on, so I think it's best to cut it here and save the remaining classes for part 2. I hope that you're finding the video helpful so far, and I'll see you in a few days where I'll conclude this. Like the video if you liked it, and thanks for watching. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals.
I can't put that there.
We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.
Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. Let's not waste any time here and jump right into part 2 of my Horde race picking guide for Classic World of Warcraft. If you're looking for part 1, I'll have it linked in the description. This video doesn't really make sense without it, so definitely watch that first. In that one, we covered all of the base racials, and we went over the warrior class, so let's go over the rest, starting with the rogue. For PvE, both daggers or swords, I have Orc as number 1 here, and it's basically Blood Fury for that attack power boost. Note that rogues couldn't wield axes until the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, so don't pay any mind to their axe specialization. And the other bonus is just that stun resist,
See you later.
which has limited use in PvE, but it's better than nothing. I do have Undead next at number 2, basically for the Will of the Forsaken. Like I mentioned, there's a fair share of these CC effects in raiding and even dungeons back then. Really, you can't go wrong with either of these two. It's utility versus raw damage. Take your pick. I do have Troll trailing behind here at number 3. The impactful racial for them is the attack speed boost from Berserking. Again, same mindset from Warriors. Unless you're intentionally taking damage, the most you'll get out of this is 10% for 10 seconds. And at this point, I like to point out that it's a 3-minute cooldown, whereas all of the other actives for the Horde are just 2 minutes.
I buy and trade.
I had them above Undead for Warrior because Berserker Rage lessened the value of Will of the Forsaken for me, so since rogues don't have anything like that, they fall just behind Undead for me. For PvP, I have the same list here. Orcs number 1, mainly for that stun resist, but you also have Blood Fury there at your disposal. That gives a little more value to rogues because they're so good at escaping sticky situations, giving them more liberty to use it, and if things turn sour, get out of dodge. I have Undead next at number 2 for Will of the Forsaken, which is immensely useful for PvP. It's hard to overstate the usefulness of any CC breaker, let alone one that has immunity tied to it. And I do have Troll trailing behind here in 3rd because I don't like Berserking as much as the other racials. Pretty much the same reasoning for the Warrior.
What can I help you with?
I will say that the number 1 spot was a really tough choice. It basically came down to what would you rather counter, Warlocks and to a lesser extent Priests and Warriors with their fears, or any class that has a stun. So it's mainly a preference sort of thing. I just think stuns are more important to counter personally. Other rogues, Warrior charge stuns, Hammers of Justice. As good as Undead are, that stun racial is huge in PvP, and because of that, I have him as number 1. Again, for Troll, Berserking just isn't as good as these other choices for PvP in my opinion. If you're going for a substantial attack speed boost, you're already dead unless you have some sort of self-healing, of which rogues do not, so they take my number 3 spot in the PvP scene. Just like my logic with the Orc's Blood Fury, I think you do get more benefit as a rogue since you're more slippery. I can see getting low and then getting the full 25%, and then popping evasion or stun locking to stay alive for the full duration. It's not bad, I just think the other racials are more practical, and if you're depending on using big cooldowns to get full benefit out of this, you're kind of hindering yourself anyways. But next up, we have the Mage. For both PvE and PvP, I have Undead at number 1. Impactful racials for Undead are Will of the Forsaken, and to a lesser extent Cannibalize. And for Troll, it's basically just Berserking. PvP is an easy choice for me since I want that Fear, Charm, and Sleepbreaker over some casting speed. I'd make that trade any day. PvE is a little tougher though. I think you can make a bigger argument for some extra cast speed every 3 minutes. To me though, I just like that utility of being able to break out of CC, so I like Undead more for PvE. I don't think there's really a clear winner here though, and I wouldn't deride you for going Troll. Next up, we have the Warlock. Again, 2 choices here, Orc or Undead. For Undead, again we have the Will of the Forsaken and Cannibalize, and for Orc we have 25% stun resist and 5% more damage with pets. For PvE, once again, I like Undead here for that Will of the Forsaken. As I mentioned earlier, Warlock pets didn't do crazy damage back then as I remember. I mean, 5% is 5%, but is it really worth not being able to negate fear effects that would otherwise get you killed or pull groups of enemies to your party? For me, Undead is a clear winner for PvE. For PvP, however, Orcs take number 1 for me for that stun resistance. Warlocks in particular are pretty vulnerable to stuns. They can't blink out of them like mages, and combined with kicks, you can get locked down quite easily. So anything to help with that is hugely valuable, especially as a Warlock. And I'll take it over the Will of the Forsaken any day. I also haven't mentioned Cannibalize too much. It can be handy, I guess, but I see it as kind of minor in the PvP setting. Like, I can see situations where you get a fear off and you start eating a corpse for a 35% heal. To me, though, that's sort of an ideal situation. You have to A, get a crowd control off, such as fear or polymorph, B, have no one else around to interrupt you, and C, have a corpse nearby to eat. I don't think it's too often that the stars align like that, so I really only see this as just a bonus to have between pulls while grinding humanoid or undead mobs for either leveling or to save money on food or whatever. And next up, we have the Hunter class. 3 races to choose from here, which are Orc, Troll, and Tauren. For PvE, impactful racials for the Troll are Berserking, and although it's kind of minor, bow specialization. Orcs have stun resist and pet damage. Again, note that Blood Fury is melee attack power only, not ranged. And for Tauren, we have War Stomp, Endurance, and a bit of nature resistance. For PvE, I like Troll the best. Like I mentioned, ranged attacks don't glance, so they get limited usefulness out of ranged weapon skill, just a bit of hit and crit. Again, compared to that dwarf plus gun skill though, it is much more useful since there are many more good bows in the raiding scene. The main reason for Troll though is that attack speed buff, which compared to the other races, provides the most damage, which brings me to Orc as number 2. And as for that pet damage pretty much, something to keep in mind back then is that pets didn't have that buff where they take reduced AoE damage. They took normal damage just like any other player would, and the only difference is that they didn't get healed because healers don't want to waste their mana. So while that 5% buff is noticeable, it's not as useful as you might think, simply because your pet will be dead a lot of the times. And Tauren I have at number 3. I think they're a good choice if you plan on doing dungeons for the most part, since you actually get a use out of War Stomp. Not super useful though, as you'll be at range most of the time, because remember, hunters can't shoot enemies that are too close in Classic. For PvP, however, Orcs take number 1 for that stun resist once again, and to a lesser extent that pet damage. When your whole goal is to create distance between you and your target, that stun resist is going to be even more valuable, and that alone is why I have Orc as number 1. And I think a lot of people will hate me for this, but I actually like Troll next above Tauren. I think their Berserking is a little more useful, and that's because as a hunter, your whole goal is to get out of sticky situations. I can definitely see getting worn down by a melee just enough for a big attack speed boost, and then getting out of range through a wing clip route or whatever, and just unloading on them. For me, there's still a distant second behind Orc, but I don't know, I just like him more for PvP compared to the Tauren. The argument for Tauren is that War Stomp and increased health. It's pretty obvious the value that War Stomp brings as a hunter especially. You stun them and get distance and kite, and with the added health, they do get a lot of benefit. Remember though, if that hidden racial makes it in, they have that increased range, but they also get hit from further away, which is terrible as a hunter. And combine that with your increased size, and therefore you're easier to pick out of a crowd, I have them as number 3 personally. Winding down here though, next up we have the Shaman. Impactful racials for the Tauren are War Stomp, Endurance, and Nature Resist. Orcs, depending on your spec, get Blood Fury, Axe Specialization, and Stun Resistance, and Trolls have Berserking. I think shamans in general are pretty close to each other race-wise, no matter the spec. First though, for PvE healing, I do have Troll for that casting speed. Like I mentioned earlier, I think healers get more value out of this because if you happen to be at low health, you can get the big buff, and you also have the ability to keep yourself alive, so it's much more practical to me compared to a non-healing class. Next, I have Tauren at number 2. More health, War Stomp in case you full aggro in a dungeon, gives the tank some time to get everything off you, and nature resistance is a nice bonus. They have good survivability, which is definitely important as a healer. And I do have Orc in last tier. For healing, you pretty much just have that stun resist, which is alright. I just think you get more benefit from Taurens and Trolls for healing. For PvP, however, Orcs shoot all the way up to number 1 for me. Whether it's for healing or DPS, you'll be so thankful for that stun resistance once you realize how many there are in Classic, and how you can go from 100 to 0 in just one of them. For number 2, I have the Tauren. I like War Stomp for PvP. For healers, it's a quick stun and a heal without worry of a kick, which is definitely nice, and obviously useful offensively for DPS for locking down your target. Plus, the health boost is always good for PvP as well. And for Trolls, I have the same mindset for PvE with their attack speed buff. It's much more useful as a class that can heal itself because you can get that bigger benefit without dying immediately after using it. I just think that Tauren and Orc come out ahead in a PvP setting though. In the Alliance video, I did cover some of the more unpractical roles, so I'll just do the same here for Shaman. As a remember, they fell under the same curse as Paladins in the raiding scene. They were mainly relegated to just healing. I think Elemental had mana problems, and Enhancement just had damage problems, but I'll talk about them here anyways because, hey, why not? So, for Enhancement PvE, I like Orc first. They're pretty hard to beat because they have Axe Specialization, which as you know by now, is hugely important for melee classes. And not only that, but Blood Fury for that attack power, and also the stun resist is nice to have. There is an old axe called Nightfall, which has a good debuff for spellcasters. Enhancement Shamans can wield this if they so choose, so that lines up nicely with their plus skill with axes. If Nightfall is 100% your only goal, you're probably better off going Troll for that attack speed for more procs. I doubt there are many out there though, whose rating aspirations sum up to keeping up 1 debuff on bosses. I personally think that's quite nuts, but hey, there it is. Not creating an entire character for 1 debuff though, Trolls come in second for me for that attack speed, which I think scales well with Shamans. Enhancement is all about those Wind Fury procs, right? So get in more attacks for more chances at chunking your enemies. And Tauren is more of a survival race again. They bring some utility for dungeons, but in the raiding scene, the main things you're looking at here are the increased health and just a bit of nature resistance. For Elemental, it's all the same reasoning, except that Orcs get pushed down to last because their bonuses are melee oriented. Elemental Shamans don't have a need for weapon skill nor melee attack power, so instead Troll comes in number 1 for that cast speed, and then Tauren in number 2 for the survivability, and Orcs trail in third just for that stun resistance really. And I did say that I would cover everything, so next up we have tanking. In the comments of the last video, I promised some dude that I would include this, so probably like 1 person will find this helpful, but whatever, a promise is a promise, and I think it'll be fun. A lot of you are probably scratching your heads right now, but Enhancement Shamans were designed to be tanks back then. It's why their Earth Shock generates threat, and they have various totems and weapon enhancements designed to hold aggro and reduce damage. It just didn't work out that way since they were quite squishy. They could only use mail armor, so they were quite tough to heal, so most players just chalked Enhancement up to a damage roll instead. But for the crazy few out there, here's my order. It's actually a tough choice, since all 3 of them have pretty good bonuses. I think for the most part, we'll be tanking 5-mans, so because of this, my list is sort of catered around that. I think similar to Paladins, you maybe saw Shamans rarely tank some fights, such as the Twin Emperors possibly, since one of them was immune to physical damage. But for the most part, it's 5-mans, so I have Tauren at number 1 since they get more value out of that War Stomp. The health is decent, but if you're mainly going to be tanking dungeons, you have to bump up or stomp a bit. And trolls and orcs come in at number 2 for me. You could go either way, I think. Trolls have their attack speed buff, which is nice for tanks since you'll be taking damage. And for orc, as a shaman, I think weapon speed isn't as crucial as it is for warriors for tanking, so maybe that opens up axes more for you to take advantage of their plus skill with them. It's hard to decide for me. I guess if you forced me to choose, I'd go troll because I like their racial for tanking quite a bit. And we also have the priest. Just like the Alliance video, I wanted to save these for last since they're a special case, and that's because depending on your race, priests get special abilities. Remember, dwarves got Fear Ward for the Alliance, which made them the envy of every other priest. The Horde ones are much more closer, I'd say, though. Just 2 races available for priest, which are Undead and Troll. The Undead get the Touch of Weakness, which is the next melee attack on the caster, will cause some shadow damage, and reduce damage caused by the attack by 20 for 2 minutes. And their bigger one is Devouring Plague, which is an extra dot. Afflicts the target with a disease that causes some pretty heavy shadow damage over 24 seconds, and heals you for the amount inflicted. 3-minute cooldown, and quite a high mana cost. Trolls get the Hex of Weakness, which weakens the target, reducing damage caused by 20, and reduces healing by 20% for 2 minutes with no cooldown. They also get Shadow Guard, which is a 3-charge shield, which triggers when struck in combat. It does a bit of shadow damage to the attacker, basically a shadow version of the Shaman's Lightning Shield. For PvE healing, I like Undead over Troll. In addition to those priest racials, it's Will of the Forsaken versus Berserking basically, and I think a CC breaker is much more valuable than some extra casting speed. As for the priest racials, nothing really too crazy in the PvE healing scene. You really don't want to use Devouring Plague since it's such a high mana cost. I think the strongest is actually the Hex of Weakness for the Troll. There aren't many, but there are some fights that have healing mechanics, and if you don't have a Mortal Strike in the raid, this can be a good backup. Off the top of my head, the Ebonrock fight would get some use out of this if your Arms Warrior is absent. Something to keep in mind though with 1.12 is that you can only fit 16 debuffs on one single enemy, so guilds are kind of picky with what debuffs that they want active. So, although this is a nice backup for encounters where the mobs heal, it's probably not something you can have active all the time, simply because there are probably better debuffs to put on. It depends on your raid makeup, really. So, both of these are good choices. I just like Undead more for that CC breaker. Next though, we have PvP healing. Although it was a much tougher choice here, I still have Undead at number 1. Devouring Plague, while it's more useful for DPS, can still be handy for a little extra damage and healing to keep yourself alive. As for the Touch of Weakness, this isn't huge in my opinion. It's just a little buff to throw on to slightly reduce some damage. On the other hand, for Troll, the Hex of Weakness gets much more valuable in PvP situations, I think. Any healing reduction is very useful, and if you worry about the mana cost, you can even cast the lower rank ones, and you'll still get the 20% reduction out of it. As for Shadow Guard, this may seem sucky at first, but there does exist a talent called Blackout for priests, which gives shadow damage a 10% chance to stun the target for 3 seconds if you max it out. So this shield can save your butt, since it is shadow damage. I think if you're just talking about these priest racials, Troll actually wins, but what pushes Undead over for me is that Will of the Forsaken once again. That Fear, Charm, and Sleep Breaker is just too much to pass up in a PvP setting without contending against orcs, as good as the racials are for the Troll priests. It's another one that isn't really clear though in my opinion. If I saw a Troll priest running around, I can respect why they made that choice, certainly. For PvE and PvP DPS on the other hand, it is a pretty easy choice for me. Undead Shadow Priests gave me nightmares back in the day. I think that they were the best 1 vs 1 class in the entire game, maybe being countered only by a Retribution Paladin or something. With Devouring Plague being shadow damage and healing the priest, they just pump out so much damage and combined with their shields are quite tanky as well. Really, they're one of the reasons why I value Stoneform so much in my Alliance video. So for PvP, I think it's an easy choice here. It's a Fear Breaker and a Super Dot versus some casting speed, a healing debuff, and a stun shield with the proper talents. For me, I'd pick Undead any day. As for PvE, like I said in the Alliance video, Shadow Priests had mana problems, so they weren't the best, but they had a nice debuff that definitely gave them some value. I still like Undead, since I think the Priest racials are pretty even, and I just personally prefer Will over Berserking. Devouring Plague, I don't put too much value on, since you're so mana starved anyways, but if it's a do or die situation and you need a lot of damage quickly, it's an option. And next, we have the hardest class out of all of them. This was the reason why this video took so long to make. Again, I'll let you guess on why I made these choices. But that's about it. Dang, these videos turned out to be much longer than the Alliance one. Sorry about that, but again, the Horde have such great racials that a lot of these required more thought and explanation. People used to say that if you want to be the best at PvP, you go Horde, and I gotta tell you, I agree with them. Alliance racials are strong in their own right, but the Horde just take them to the next level in a vanilla setting, I think. And PvE as well. It's harder to find a racing class combination that doesn't synergize well as Horde, in my opinion. They're just good all around. Note that these are just my opinions. I don't pretend to be all-knowing in this game, but at the very least, I hope that my logic sort of helped you in your choices. If I got anything wrong, just like the Alliance video, I'll have a pinned comment that'll update if I made any major errors, so definitely check that out. And just look at the comments in general. People often post stuff that I didn't think of, so you'd benefit from giving those a read as well before you make your decision. Remember, it's permanent this time. No race changes, no faction changes, or even a barber shop, so think carefully about what exactly you want to do in the game and go from there. If the Alliance is more your speed, I'll have a full guide similar to this one linked in the description for you. And now that I have both factions covered, I think I might work on a class picking guide next. So keep an eye out for that if you enjoyed this. I hope that you found the video helpful. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.
Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. So, you've decided to join many others in the world of Azeroth as it was in 2004 to 2007, referred to as Vanilla or Classic. I'm sure you have many questions, the biggest of them probably being, what class should I play? As you would imagine, classes have changed and evolved.
Never see it coming. You'll see that my mind is too fast for eyes. You're done it. Now the time into my way, stand down. It's a trap, one more step, and you're dead. Why, just a peek a second ago, clear blue skies, but now lightning struck your last resolve. It's not an accident that no one hears your cries as your last strength seems to dissolve. You'll never see it coming. You'll see that my mind is too fast for eyes. You're done in by the time it's hit you, your last surprise. I'm coming for you. My game's always so fast, so fine. You're spun in by the net you didn't catch it in time. Better think about your game. Are you sure your next move's the right one for you? Are you sure you won't get outmaneuvered again and again, my friend? You'll never see it coming. You'll see that my mind is too fast for eyes. You're done in by the time it's hit you, your last surprise. I'm coming for you. My game's always so fast, so fine. You're spun in by the nets you didn't catch it in time.
Payload's on the way.
Feeling grand.
Moving out.
It's now or it's never, and I've got to make my decision. This time it could be my moment. Is this a mirage or a chance to fulfill my mission? A river in a dry land, the last taste in a lost hand, a heartbeat for a tin man, oasis in a thin land. I gave from the balance, but I'm standing on razor's edge now. Move quick or my life is over. One step just to think, then I'm out of this field of vision. Don't ask when I'm ready, but I'm ready to strike him down now. A chance at a new start, there's no time for indecision. Remind us what we're here for. Create hell in my world of conflict. One goal is what keeps me going. Take back what I lost to the bosses of greed and fear, yeah. Don't ask why I'm ready, but I'm ready to strike them down now. The time for a new start is constantly drawing nearer. A river in a dry land, the last piece in a lost hand. When the hope of a new beginning burned our feet, now we need it, a heartbeat for a teen man, an oasis in a sea's land. Remind us what we're here for, creating new life, creating rivers in the desert. When a cool drop of water's all I need, it's gonna clear my head of anger and greed. A place to refresh heart and mind. Can I find some time? And rivers in a dry land, the last taste in a lost hand. When the hope of new beginnings burned our feet, now we need it, a heartbeat for a teen man, an oasis in a sea's land. Remind us what we're here for, creating new life, creating rivers in the desert.
Windows down, pedal to the sneakers, turn up the volume.